The Chains of Freedom, a podcast that is meant to break down some of the systems throughout our history. And it's going to be primarily history-based. I'm Aaron. I'm here with Andrea.
Hello.
And, well, we'll just get right into it. What's the point? What's the point of the Chains of History? It's a profound statement. It's kind of an oxymoron, if you will. But the thing is how free are we really? Are we truly as free as we like to pretend? Are we as systemically free as we'd like to pretend? We're going to dive into the history of a lot of different little systems. We're going to go into the education system. We're going to go into the tax system. We're going to go into the military system. We're going to dive into the fact that, or into systems rather, that we might not even be realized are kind of pre-programmed to make us feel a certain way. Like a good example, and we'll get into this obviously in later cast, but so the military, they ended the draft in the 70s after Vietnam, which was a messy deal, right?
Right.
But if you notice, after the draft and after the Vietnam veterans return, it was a big ordeal. The Vietnam veterans were treated like trash.
Garbage, yeah.
And so what you ended up running into was just a lot of veterans who, one, didn't want to be there in the first place, and then once they got home, they got shit on. So they got shit on twice.
Pretty much.
Drug out of your home and shit on by the Viet Cong, and then drug back home and shit on by your own countrymen. But after that, everything got really patriotic, super, super patriotic, right? Support the troops, support the military, support the flag. And now this patriotism has its own history, which we'll go into obviously as well. But just as an example of what we're doing here, so did they really have to end the draft when they could hyper-patriotize all voluntary military? Granted, voluntary military has been institutionalized in the fabric of this country since the Revolutionary War, since before the Revolutionary War, with little city-state militias, colonial militias, and what have you. And there's a lot of volunteers, but even the Revolutionary War, a lot of people may or may not know, had a draft. So now we're not drafting, although the draft is not abolished, it's still around, should we need it. But ultimately, with this hyper-patriotism, you have a lot of people who willingly volunteer. We have a force of some 1.8 million across all branches of the military, to include the Space Force now, which I wish was around then. When I signed up, I would have probably signed up Space Force.
Right.
I have no opinion one way or the other about it. I kind of want to go be Master Chief or something.
There you go.
So it's a question of, do we really need a draft if we can hyper-patriotize the system to get the force needed for volunteer? I mean, it's picky now. There's a lot of people who want to sign up. It's not like it was in the 70s where if your kid is pissing you off, you drag him off to the recruiter's office and he's off, you know. My boy ain't right. Go fix him up, U.S. military. They don't do that anymore. Now they're even picky about who they take. You could all your life want to be in the military, and they almost go like the movie 300, Sparta style, where you're too short or you got a humped back or you talk funny. It's not quite that picky, and there are waivers, you know, for certain circumstances, but they're actually picky about who they take in down, you know, from the Marines and the Army, which are said to be the easiest to get into because usually they need bodies. They just need bodies to catch bullets.
Right.
And as an Army vet myself, there's no shame in whatever branch you serve. Even the little sister of the Navy, the Coast Guard. Those guys were badass in Vietnam. A lot of people don't know. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's not to get into some, you know, we're going to cover a lot in a historical sense as far as these systems are analyzed. We're not going to get into any one subject that deserves their own special attention. There will be a lot of mentions with it, though. You know, we'll talk about the Civil War, but we're not going to go into every detail of the Civil War. And there's plenty of casts out there that cover solely the Civil War, and I'm sure somebody will beat me up on something I say about it. Anyway, in a generality, most people know what the Civil War is. We're going to go into World War II. We're going to go into the unspoken Civil War, which a lot of people are not aware of. I might go into that actually with the next cast, because I'm going to do not so much a continuation from episode 1 to episode 2, but I'm going to have a Labor Day special, which is coming up, because Labor Day is one of my favorite holidays, and I think we have a lot to extrapolate from what Labor Day is. It's, you know, a lot of people, we put a lot of emphasis on Memorial Day, we put a lot of emphasis on Veterans Day, we put a lot of emphasis on the 4th of July. Labor Day is our day, people. If you've ever gotten up, put on your boots, and gotten to work, I don't care if you're flipping burgers, sweeping floors, taking bullets for your country, delivering mail, sitting in an office, just punching programming in.
The nurses and the doctors.
The nurses,
nowadays,
the doctors, anybody. That it is an American holiday with a very rich history that is solely for the American people, and we'll get into that with that Labor Day special. Very important. So yeah, we're just going to start breaking down these various little systems and how they apply. Now, the first thing we should probably get into is just minor introduction. I'm Aaron. I'm an Army veteran. I am a father. I'm a son, like so many of you out there. Well, I mean, some of your daughters, but you get the idea. And yeah, tell us about yourself there, Andrea.
I'm a CNA. I work at home. I'm a mom of a special needs son with autism. I also take care of my mom, whose health isn't the best. Speaking of Labor Day, because she worked pretty hard. And yeah, pretty much most of it.
So we'll get into a lot of things. First off, the email for the cast is chainsfreedom1@gmail, which is also the same as the YouTube site. And so, of course, the comments, the scrutiny, the questions are always welcome. Feel free to email anytime. It's not a personal email, so I will make a point to check as often as I'll check it. I will check it. I will check it at least once a day and try to respond as much as I can. And sometimes, you might have questions that aren't addressed in the specific cast that we're doing, but it will be addressed in a later one, and I can either direct you to one that maybe has already been done, maybe you missed one, or that we're going to be doing, so that way you can maybe tune in. And the overall dream is going to be getting into maybe like we can do a live broadcast of a cast, which of course the cast itself will be edited and cleaned up, but live it gives you a chance to interact a little bit more real time via comments, emails, whatever. So as a lot of people would state, freedom isn't free. So I propose the question: is freedom freedom? I think it's a pretty profound question, but I think it needs to be asked. The examination of history. History is, of course, it's poetry. It rhymes. It's occasionally conjoins big periods of time. Sometimes we walk around, we see ourselves living a moment of history, and be like, hey, I kind of feel like I read about this, but I mean, it rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. It's kind of like that George Lucas thing a little bit,
Right.
History rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. But if we recognize these rhymes, we might be able to understand ourselves as a collective whole above all else. The periods covered will be, 1400 medieval Europe, all the way up through to today, because history is every day. Every day something happens. There's always a moment in history. It needs to be documented by somebody. Not this somebody, but somebody, nonetheless. And we're going to try and draw the comparisons and the parallels of history, Perhaps, was the fascist movement in the 1930s that brought, of course, the rise of Hitler. And maybe how that compares to, the fascist movements of the Spanish Inquisition. Or maybe not so much fascism. That was definitely a different political structure during the Spanish Inquisition. It was, however, a nationalist idealism. The nationalist idealism at that time, of course, being Catholicism. And, of course, the Nazi fascism of the 1930s was, more, well, it was fascist. What can I say?
Well, they were also hyper-patriotic, too, because...
Well, so were the inquisitors of the Spanish Inquisition. Patriotism, good or bad or ugly, we might examine that as well. Is there a toxic patriotism? Can you be too star-spangled awesome? I think that's definitely worth examining. And even not to sway anybody one way or the other, I really don't care what people think or how they vote as far as their political orientation or what have you. This is more examination. It's going to come down to if you learn something and maybe even feel need to teach something. That's why I'm more than willing to welcome the emails and the comments and whatnot. And maybe even we'll set aside a little section where we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, because I always have like that mentality where if you're patriotic, you think this way, but if you're not thinking in that same mindset, you're not patriotic at all.
Well, and that would be kind of like the not so much patriotism, but like the Reformation period of medieval England, when the Protestants, obviously Protestant translating loosely into protester, broke from the Catholic Roman Empire, right? The Roman Holy Catholic Empire, Holy Roman Catholic. Anyway, you know what I mean. You start having these inquisitions a little bit prior to that, but even during that, on both sides, both the Protestants and the Catholics, because they thought that they worshipped God the same or better, or the way that God wanted them to, which, there's still traces of these conflicts to this day. For a good example, I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was a train station bombing in Spain. I believe it was Madrid, Spain, 2004. And the terrorists at the time, their holy jihad, if you will, was based on the atrocities that they suffered during the Crusades. And, I mean, you're talking several hundred years later, and
Right.
some of this is still going on. So, again, history rhymes, but sometimes there's things that still have a reflection of our history that we are not even aware of to this day. Like sometimes we feel a certain way, or we think a certain way, or we have a certain belief system into something, and we're not even sure necessarily where we got it from. Sometimes it's just you're just like, oh, I celebrate Christmas. Why? Why do you celebrate Christmas in this way? There's nothing wrong
Yeah,
with
in a
celebrating
specific
Christmas,
way.
but in this specific way, like why do you have ham instead of turkey, maybe, or pick your tradition. Everybody's got tradition. Most of them, you could say, the American idealism of a Christmas tradition is pretty standard, but every family's got their own little thing
The
that
little
they do.
quirks or little
And
tradition that
and
they
where
do.
did that come from? It might be their great grandfather. Well, great granddad always put on the Santa hat, and he drunkenly marched around saying "ho ho ho" without the beard. I don't know. But so as tradition would follow, now it's your turn to dance around with the Santa hat.
Right.
Drunken is your choice or not, but as tradition, something that the kids enjoyed, regardless of why they knew they were enjoying it. And it's just
they remember it and just take it on to their families when they get older as well too.
and there's traditions from historical periods that reach up into this day. Like I said, you got people still fighting the Crusades to this day. You have people still fighting the Protestant Reformation battles against Catholicism to this day. And you can't really say they're right or wrong, or at least I'm not going to say they're right or wrong. It's just a fascinating sequence to understand where a lot of this mentality comes from. So the question again, is freedom free? They say freedom isn't free. I ask, is freedom free? And with the analysis of these systems, I'm going to get into a little story time for you guys, and I'm going to talk about the Allegory of the Cave. Allegory of the Cave was written by Pluto, and, well, it's an allegory. It's written down as per through Pluto, which, semantics. It's written by Pluto, and it's a narration between him and his brother, as narrated by Socrates, his mentor. And it's important, I think, to hit on this point, and it's a concept I want to get into. There's a couple concepts we're going to get into that you just keep in mind, one of which is the Great Chain of Being, which is a theological ideology that derived since like 1200 AD out of the Dark Ages Europe, when people were still slaying dragons and dancing with their minstrels in the Black Forest. And so, and of course, as I mentioned Plato, and that's well beyond the ADs in general. We're talking like 3600 BC to maybe even 4600 BC. I'll fact check that for you guys and get a more solid date if you want. But the point is, it's a very old allegory. And the way it starts is, so imagine being born, and you're born in this cave, and in this cave with these chains, you're neither allowed to look to your left or to your right. Behind you burns a fire, which casts shadows. Obviously, you can see the silhouette of an unknown level of other captives from your left and right. You can't look to your left or right, but they're there with your periffs, and just how you can see the shadows dancing off the wall. And between the fire and what you could only assume is your fellow captives are some puppeteers. They make silhouettes on the cave walls, and they make up whatever they want. You know, they might show trees, they tell little stories, they show various animals, but they're all in shadow. It's a big shadow theater. And as time goes on, as you grow up, as you hear the others who've come before you, and maybe some that have even come after you, as far as you're growing up into this state of bondage, you start hearing their stories. They start making up their own stories about the shadows they see on the wall. They start playing games with it. They start entertaining themselves with this. They start giving themselves some merit. Somebody, the guy who makes the best story, he might be the chief storyteller. The guy who has the most ethical outlook based off of the shadows on the wall. He might be the chief chained guy, the chief slave, right? I say slave loosely because they're not, in this allegory, they're not technically enslaved, they're captivated. So I guess chief prisoner would be better term for it.
Almost like making their own reality more livable for the situation that they're in, pretty much.
You might say, yeah, and it's an adaptability. I mean, they're obviously fed and watered. It's not relative, or it's not specifically important to the story, but you know, so one of the prisoners one day, he wakes up and his chains are loosed, and at first he's really terrified. Oh, this has never happened before, and he realizes he can look to the left and right. He just sees people all the way down to his left and people all the way down to his right, and they're sitting there and they're doing their daily dirt with the shadows on the cave walls, and they're you know, still doing their day in day out thing. They're telling their stories, they're laughing. Sometimes they're ridiculing one another, shaming one another, and at first the prisoner thinks, "Oh man, I'm going to sit real quiet here. I'm going to sit tight because this is like really scary. I don't know what this means with these chains gone." And you know, so he's like, "Well, you know, I'm free. I'm going to look around because it's the first time I can look around." And he fumbles around in the dark, and in the darkness in the distance, he sees a light at the end of the tunnel, as they say. The light at the end of the tunnel is obviously the cave entrance, and he manages to make his way out there. Now, when he first gets out there, he is completely blinded because his eyes are used to just being in the darkness, and his only reality being the shadows on the wall and the fire behind him. As his eyes adjust, he begins to see the natural world as natural things are. The shadows suddenly have colors, they make sounds, they have personalities, birds singing in the trees having the leaves rustled by the breeze which he's felt for the first time, that didn't come with the dampness and the coolness that could only be a breeze of the cave, you know. And for the oil field guys, it probably was not H2S because there was a lot of prisoners out there. If you understand that little oil field joke, you will have a good laugh. Or maybe you're a miner if you understand that joke too. But everything he sees, you know, it's going to have, suddenly it has color, has texture, has personality. The world as a whole, he can feel the grass on his feet. He didn't even know what grass was. He always saw, maybe on the shadows, he saw kind of like what was a perceived floor as these little shadow characters danced up and down it, you know, moving along, but he never understood what it was to even just walk on the grass. And as he's walking around, he's exploring, he realizes the flowers have a fragrance, you know, and so do, you know, the weird stuff coming out of the cow's back end, which is not so pleasurable, but it's something new. And so, as he's exploring this new reality, he does this from sun up to sundown. As the sun sets, he's used to the darkness, and so he thinks to himself, you know, I'm good with this. I'm good with sitting in the dark. And he curls up, starts to get cold. The darkness of night has a nice cool breeze to it. He starts to hear the creatures with their rumbles and tumbles of the night. He starts to get frightened. As he gets frightened, he starts longing for the cave, longing to be amongst his fellow prisoners, his brothers, if you will, his compatriots. And he spends most of his night in a half-slept, half-terrified craze, thinking, the second I get up, the second the sun comes back up, if it comes back up, because you gotta remember, this is new to him, I am going to make back for that cave. I'm going to make back for that cave. I'm going to sit amongst my fellow compatriots. I don't even have to be chained. I will sit there and just join back in, and I won't think twice of it. And as the sun rises and he starts to feel the warmth on his face and the activities of daily life start to pick up, he feels comforted. He feels comforted again in the warmth and the glow of the sun, and how the creatures of the world come back, and the creatures of the night go to bed. And he starts making his way for the cave. He's just completely determined to go sit amongst his brothers again. He's like, this is cool. This is pretty. I'm gonna go back to the cave, and I'm just gonna wing it. I'm gonna sit there and act like this doesn't even I don't like this. So he makes his way back to the cave, and first thing he notices is, well, my eyes are pretty well adjusted to light, so now I gotta fumble my way through this dark cave until they can readjust again. The cave is dark, it's damp. Smells a little bit funnier too now that I've had a taste of fresh air. And he gets back down there, his fellow prisoners didn't even know he was gone. Of course, keep in mind they're not allowed to look to their left or right the way they're bound. But even his little silhouette, the top of his head that was reflecting off the cave wall, was no longer there. They discounted him as they just didn't pay no mind to it. They're so wrapped up in their own little world. They continued on as if nothing ever happened. And, sad to say, if I'll interject here, is a different point. How many times have you felt that way at work? You take a day off, you show up, and nothing changed,
It's almost, you then start to notice that they have worked as a company long before you got there. And so if you were to just not be there, they still survive plenty without you, without notice.
Well, let's take it a little bit closer, a little bit more personal. Because, everybody knows that to some degree your work doesn't give a shit.
Right.
But that being said, let's say, let's put it this way. Everybody's had a little group of friends, be it high school or maybe college or what have you. And you've taken a sabbatical from your friendship circle. Maybe you needed to study more. Maybe you went overseas with your parents. And when you get back, they're happy to see you. But life kind of continued on without you. So, and I think everybody's gone through that, and everybody knows that feeling.
They almost even have gotten more distant from you.
Yeah, suddenly now.
Because you took time for yourself.
So suddenly people are, they might, Johnny's driving now, and Tracy's pregnant, and well, where the hell did this happen? And now you spend more time trying to catch up than enjoying your friends.
Yeah.
So, but that's kind of the feeling this guy's going through here. He had a minor sabbatical. We'll X amount of time. This is a story without time. And as he's sitting there and they're carrying on with their lives, he tries to sit back down with them. At first, he tries to sit comfortably the way he had been for most of his life. Tries to sit still. Tries to sit and pretend as if he's bound. But he's not bound anymore. He keeps looking to his left and right. And he looks at the shadows on the wall, and he's suddenly realizing, well, I know what that looks like. He's even trying to tell his buddies next to him, kind of leaning over, trying not to be so conspicuous, like, hey, that thing's actually it's brown and it sounds like it goes moo.
Yeah.
And his fellow prisoners, they're kind of scoffing at him, like, shut up, man, you're messing up the story right now.
Right.
That's a tree. Their leaves are green, and you can feel the breeze, not like down here where it's just kind of damp. But there's an actual breeze that carries the smell of the vegetation.
Right.
And I can smell it, and it smells beautiful. And they're like, man, shut up.
You're ruining my favorite part of this movie.
Basically, right? It's not even a spoiler alert. That's like watching. It's like watching cartoons. So Chuck Smith. It's not Chuck Smith. Anyway, the guy who made Looney Tunes.
Oh. I don't know.
Something Chuck. Yeah. Anyway, he made a lot of animations during World War II. A lot of them are really funny, depending on the time. But sitting there watching animations during World War II, say you see Daffy Duck sitting there mocking Hitler. This guy is the guy that's sitting there and be like, well, that would have never happened with Hitler because Goebbels and Himmler would have already had him arrested for blasphemy or anti-fascist behavior or treason or, so he's being this guy right now, okay?
Right, yeah.
He's being the guy that's he's Mr. Fact Check right now. And it's driving his fellow prisoners next to him crazy. They're getting really annoyed with him. Like, hey, that thing in the sky, that's actually a bird. And it makes us.
Right.
It makes them. It sings and it makes some obnoxious noises from time to time, and it'll poop in mid-flight.
Well, it's almost like a super nerd, like you're watching Harry Potter or Star Wars.
Yeah, and you got to sit there and did you know that Harry Potter's wand was made of yew branch that was struck by lightning up in Windsor? What? I don't care. Make with the magic, you know.
Luke's lightsaber was totally different in the sequel than it was in this movie.
Yeah, and so you know, like, well, when they made Luke's lightsaber, they used this film lens, and then by the time they got turned into the Jedi, they stopped using film lenses, and I think it's trash. Well, shut up, dude. It's a movie.
He's ruining their.
So he's ruining it, and they're starting to get frustrated with him. But he himself is starting to get really agitated with this because they're sitting there and they're like, oh yeah, that thing flying in the sky, it goes moo. And that thing walking on the ground, it goes ka, you know, and he knows better because he's seen it with his own eyes. He heard it with his own ears and he smelt it with his own nose. All 5 senses working in tandem. And he realizes that everything they're making up is really just that, it's just made up. And he can't take it anymore. So he stands up amidst the crowd and he stands in front of them. Now his face is illuminated, he's visibly irritated. They've never seen each other's faces before because even to each other, they were just shadows on the wall.
Right.
So they're kind of like in shock and awe. You're like, listen, everybody. I know, I get what you're doing. I get what you're doing. This is great, but this isn't real. This is not real, not by any sense of the matter. You guys, really, seriously, listen to me. Let me see what I can do about getting you out there, Joe, and I'll show you myself.
He's going full Annie Wilkes on him.
Kinda, yeah. That's not how a cock-a-doodle happened. Yeah, he's going full on batshit with these guys, and so, but they start getting irritated with him. Shut up, sit down. You know what you're talking about? Craziness, madness, witchcraft, all the. Right. He's a radical, you know, which we've heard in the annals of history, even up to this day. He's a radical, you know. Yeah. Burn the witch, you know.
Heretic.
Yeah, basically. And so he starts arguing with them, and his argument turns into just general anger. And he's like, here, finally to the point, I will show you. And he grabs the guy we just called Joe for the purpose of the story.
Right.
In ancient Greece, there's a guy named Joe. There's Joes all across history. Doesn't matter what time period you are. If you look at the sketches and drawings on the wall, there's Joe. There's Joe the caveman. Okay.
Right. Last name, and then John, first name.
Right. John Joe the caveman. So he grabs Joe, and they're fighting, they're struggling. The other prisoners are trying to help Joe the best they can. They're pretty much bound, but they're trying to bite at him, they're trying to kick at him, they're trying to elbow him, you know. Some are even trying to wrap the chains around his neck, and he's able to free this guy. And this guy's fighting the whole time, too, because he thinks he's being kidnapped by a madman.
Worse than a toddler at this point.
Worse than a toddler, but more so importantly, like, you know, he thinks he's getting dragged into the creepy madman at this point.
The free candies.
So
Buffalo Bill van.
Basically. So he doesn't know what's going on. This guy's dragging him through the darkness of the cave. And finally, after long last, he manages to drag this guy up into the open air. Now, at first he thinks he's been blinded by this guy. The same experience that our hero here, our protagonist, had when he first got into the light. His eyes weren't adjusted. So all he sees is this bright light and just this sensory overload of sounds. He's hearing moos and birds, and he don't know what's going on. But as his eyes start to focus finally, he starts to see that, you know, this guy wasn't crazy. Not only was he not crazy, he was telling the truth the whole time. You know, the cows do say moo. The birds don't say moo. The cows say moo. Which we're calling them cows now. Which, you know, they named them like that in the cave. For all we know, they were probably ox for all we care.
Right.
But that's, you know, that's a linguistic thing, and you know, I mean, look how many different names you have for different birds.
Right. Well, and then if they always stayed in there, they didn't know any better or proper names anyway. So. Yeah. And
so, you know, John Joe the caveman, he's suddenly really apologetic. He's, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fight you so much. I didn't mean to bite you. I wasn't trying to fight you so much. I didn't know. I thought you were talking crazy talk. Our protagonist, he says, hey, well, that's great. I'm glad you believe me, and I forgive you because I had to show you this. So the next question moving forward is, what do we do from here? Because I don't really want to go back in that cave. Those guys were, you know, ready to burn me at the stake, pretending they weren't chained down. They probably would have. And so they think about this a long time. And John Joe, the caveman, he finally looks up and says, you know, we kind of have a duty to get back down there and save our fellow prisoners, save our brothers. They don't have a clue what this is, and they're just living a lie. They're living a lie. They're chained down. They can't even move. They can't even see each other's faces. Seeing your face was a shock for the first time. You know, our protagonist, which we'll call Luke Skywalker because it's just easier.
Right.
So Luke Skywalker takes him over to the pool, John Joe. He goes, look at your own face. And it's the first time he's seeing his own face. He's flabbergasted, he's blown away. He sees textures, he sees colors. He sees tiredness and emotional expression for the first time. He goes, yep, that settles it. Luke, we must go to the Dagobah system. No, I'm just kidding. We got to go back into that cave. We got to save our brothers. And
they're all doing stuff like Matrix style now.
and the Matrix is loosely, it's pulled right out of the allegory. It's an interpretation. I wouldn't say it's
Right.
loosely interpreted off of. It's basically the allegory of the cave, modernized, and it's got Keanu Reeves. So I mean, if you guys want to go watch the Matrix, that's basically the allegory of the cave in a technologically savvy world. It's kind of it's largely based off the exact philosophy. And as you know, in the Matrix, their goal is to go in there, and Morpheus is always talking about, like, yeah, until they're broken free of the system, they're always part of that system. That system is always trying to destroy you because the system's survival depends on these people don't realize that they're part of the system.
And some of them are really super content being part in it, and that's what happened to that one guy. He wanted to be basically shoved back into his own cave.
Well, and that's why in the allegory it's important to note the dark night and the fear and the willingness to go sit back amongst the fellow prisoners, because being afraid of something and trying to reacclimate yourself into something, once you get to see the truth for the first time, it's hard to unsee something. I guess that's the best way to put it. It's hard to unsee something. And so this guy sees something, he can't unsee it, and he's screaming and he's tantruming and he's pleading and he's even getting beat up to save his fellow prisoners and unchain them one at a time. And, you know, they get some, they lose some. It's an ongoing battle with this cave. And that's basically where the allegory itself ends, because it's left up to interpretation. I think it's also important to note that, Pluto was imprisoned and killed himself, and Socrates was, of course, hung. So these people's ideas weren't so, on their own reality at the time, because even though they were great philosophers, they themselves had some controversy behind them that got their days numbered as well. So maybe they themselves were trying to return to the cave and free some of their fellow Grecians, if you will. Of course, that would have been the Hellenistic period, so it was city-states. They weren't all Greek. You had the
Right.
Athenians, you had the Spartans, you had that's technicality, that's semantics. The point stands that the people of Greece had their own little cave thing going on, and it's important to bring up Greece as a whole, because Greece was one of our first recorded democracies. So, I'm not going to get into the whole Greek history thing, the mythos or the political parts of it, because we're talking about U.S. history and our current systems. I will refer to it from time to time. I always give a little bit of context, but I'm not going to go so far out of my way as to start getting into it, although I will say Greek history and mythology is probably one of my personal favorites to read about.
Well, then plus we get a lot of our government stuff from over there anyway. All the
Do we, though? Do we? We're taught in school that the Greek democracy is where we got our ideas for the great Greek democracy. Now, it's true, a lot of the scholarly folks of the early founding days of America, they followed the teachings of Aristotle and Pluto and the Greek ethics and politics, right?
Right.
But the Republic then looked more like Rome first, right?
Oh, yeah,
To be fair.
to be fair.
And then to top that off, one of the first major republics of I guess you could say the transition into this newer world, right? Just before the landing of James, or the founding of Jamestown, right? Or the landing of Cuba, or Haiti. I think it was Haiti. I know it was Haiti. Anyway, by Columbus. But one of the first major republics was actually the Dutch, who took it upon themselves to break away from the idea of kings and lords and all the chess pieces,
Oh, the
right?
chess, yeah.
But they weren't necessarily a constitutional republic. They were not a constitutional republic, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I'm not getting into Dutch history again, American history, and how those systems. And the only reason why I'll get into to some of the stuff like the Dutch republics or the East India Trading Company or even the Greek democracies or even the Roman democracies is just as they come as relevance to what I'm talking about. So it'll be for context. It's not going to be in depth. And just to reiterate again. That's also to say there's a lot of great periods that deserve a lot more attention than I might seem to give them. But we'll be jumping back and forth anyway, and some might refer to the others as, points of interest, if you will. So, I mean, talking about the women's suffrage movement, talking about the labor movements, talking about the slavery movements. We're going to talk about all these systems and how these systems possibly have evolved. Did they go away? Did we abolish slavery? That's a question. Did women's suffrage really earn them, the liberties that they sought? Or maybe even more, a little bit more along the lines of a controversial idealism. Did the feminist movement an oppressive movement, even amongst women? Now, these are questions, and that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to examine some of these questions, and we're going to try to find answers through history, and see where they land. We're going to throw a dart and try and hit it on the bullseye. We're not going to hit it every time, but we'll definitely try.
Well, what better place to throw darts anyway? Because if you're going to go down to talk about a certain subject, why not talk about someone who's possibly done it already and see what that came out of it?
Well, that's the chains of freedom in a nutshell. That's the synopsis. That's the point of the cast. That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be examining our history and seeing how it applies to daily life. We're going to also be examining our history to see if freedom is free as we think of it. So to wrap up, I'd like to share a speech. I'm going to read it to you guys. It's Frederick Douglass, as spoken to the abolitionists at Rochester. It's an excerpt. I'm not going to go through the whole speech. It's July 5th, 1852. If you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, you'll know by the time we're done. Not with this speech. You can't possibly know a person after not even a whole speech, but I think it's a good way to wrap up for the day. So I guess we'll get started.
Yes.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring a humble offering to the national altar, and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to the victims of claims of gratitude, that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? Who so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee, when the chains of servitude have been torn from his limbs? I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak, and the lame might leap as in heart. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in your joyous anthems were inhumane mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, towering up to the heaven, were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying that nation in irrevocable ruin. I can today take up that plaintive lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people. He's talking because the abolitionists, as you guys know, were the people that were pro-free everybody. They didn't like slavery. They wanted every man to be free as promised by the nation. And they were there's great abolitionists out there that helped to end slavery. But see, Frederick Douglass here, he's actually talking to the abolitionists. He's talking to the people who are anti-slavery. And he's kind of like blowing their hair back a little bit with it, because he's like, hey, y'all are free, but what are you guys really doing for those of us who aren't free? He's just making a point. More so importantly, I only bring that up because I'm not trying to detract from his point. Frederick Douglass did a lot of good, and obviously that speech was in context to the black slaves of the South just before the Civil War. That being said, though, I like to borrow words from some of these people. They've said it better than I could, and we're gonna borrow a lot of different people's words: Lincoln, Douglas, Franklin, Washington, Parks, Martin Luther King. Two different guys. But we're going to borrow a lot of different words just to get our point across. So with that being said, I welcome you guys to the Chains of Freedom. Let's get to work.